Redditors who have hired a private investigator. What did you find out? My mother's dad walked out on mom, my aunt, and my grandmother when mom was just 5. A few years later, my grandmother died of a grand mal seizure. Mom was taken in by her grandparents, but she always wondered why her dad left and what became of him. In her 40s, she saved up a bit and hired a PI to track him down. Turns out he moved over time from Pittsburgh to California, where he wound up in prison for armed robbery and some other violent crimes. He died in San Quentin Penitentiary. I think mom got a lot of closure out of that. She was able to see that life would have most likely been even worse had he stayed. At least living with her grandparents, she was loved and raised to fulfill her potential. Story 2. My grandmother's first boyfriend after my grandfather died said he was a retired cop and a veteran. They enjoyed dancing to country music together and bought a new car, in her name though, even though she can't drive anymore. My uncles hired a PI. Turns out that old loser had a habit of shacking up with widows and bleeding them dry. The boyfriend, not the PI. Okay, of all the crimes, let's not target the elderly widowed grandmothers, okay? Jeez. Story 3. My sister, mid-30s, is adopted and hired one to find her estranged biological father. They came back saying that not only was he still alive and nearby, but he had a daughter, meaning she also had a biological sibling. Further digging from the PI uncovered that they weren't just similar ages either. They were exactly the same age. The evidence suggested that my sister had a twin and her birth father had taken the twin and vanished. Huge life-changing news. Eventually, through more incredible detective work, the PI realized that the daughter was actually just my sister. There was no other sibling, and they had just been investigating my sister the whole time accidentally. Needless to say, we asked for the money back. Could you imagine how awful the PI has to be that you hire him and he's just investigated you the whole time? Okay, yeah, it seems like they're typing on Reddit now, and now they're hiring a PI. Oh, this is good stuff. I gotta report this back. Stupid. Story 4. When I met my wife, she seemed to have a normal modern family. 2 moms, 2 dads. Over time, it became apparent her stepdad wasn't around much. Holidays, birthdays, you name it, he'd pop in to say hi, grab a nap, whatever, then take off again. My wife's family thought this was normal, just the way it had always been since they were teenagers. He claimed to have a job following FedEx trucks around the state to prevent theft and drug trafficking. But I thought it was strange and started making jokes about him having another family. Well, I guess it got my sister-in-law thinking because she gets a favor from the PI at her law firm. Sure enough, he has not 2 but 3 wives around the state and 5 other stepchildren between them. My sister-in-law breaks the news to her mother, who immediately changes the locks and files for divorce. They never speak again. Cold turkey. Divorce is even uncontested. As an FU, they also send the report to his other wives. Edit. I thought I was late to the thread, so I wasn't expecting as many reactions. Thanks for the gold, kind strangers. To answer some of the questions, yes, polygamy is illegal, but it's not really worth prosecuting except to make an example of people. I don't know if my MIL was his first wife or not. I do know that one of the wives had been married and divorced him between their marriage. How does it happen? Counties don't exactly share marriage certificates. His families were pretty far from each other. Was their wedding legal? No idea. IANAL. Probably the separation was just a formality for paperwork purposes, which is why it went to court, why it went uncontested, and why he never showed up again. I think he reached out once or twice, but she never answered the phone. And if he ever showed up again, we weren't told about it. My MIL is a strong, independent woman of faith who just didn't know. He fooled his stepdaughters for 15 years too. Story 5. My story is a little different. I had a PI investigate me. About 6 years ago, I became very ill with a variety of issues that left me really quite poorly. I was an optician, and so using my hands with arthritis was just never going to be a plan. So I applied for UK disability support. I sailed through and started receiving a monthly amount. Now, fast forward a few years. I then start getting restless at home, so I retrain into a job that doesn't involve my hands. I stopped receiving money, except for the benefit you get while you work. I use it for paying a better automatic car off. Well, my very nasty mother's friend saw me start work and called the benefits office, assuming I was still claiming. Unfortunately, she exaggerated and told them I was living a normal life and even running daily. So the benefits office filmed and watched me. They thought they had an aha, gotcha moment. Their PI provided photos of me walking unaided. When I sat in the meeting with a lot of smug fraud officers and my solicitor, I felt sick to my stomach. I really couldn't work out what the heck was going on. They were trying to make it look like I had been running and jogging, but I knew I walked never any further than 5 meters to my car. Anyway, solicitor pointed out the photos were screenshots of a video. Asked for the videos. Videos were of me struggling to walk. One of them, I rest on my car before opening my door. Another, I was going into a supermarket and had replaced my cane with a trolley to lean on. You get the picture. So the fraud team basically said, oops, and I never heard from them again. I spend a lot of my time trying to appear normal, and it bit me in the butt. And never trust these fraud TV shows either. I no longer speak with my mother, so I'm not sure if she is still friends. The lady did it because, quite honestly, I think she is brainwashed into thinking anyone who claims benefits must be scummy. I am doing well, thank you for asking. I started methotrexate last year, and it seems to be holding me quite steady. Do these people have, nothing else to do than watching someone hobble to their car and then wonder how much money they're getting from the government? Goodness gracious. And also, the amount of time that was probably wasted. She's got to go down, it's a whole pickle. Stay in your own lane, folks. Story 6. Hadn't heard from my mom since I was about 15. Very unstable due to drugs and alcohol, etc. When I was 29, I decided it was time to find out what happened to her. I figured if she was a Jane Doe somewhere, then I could put her to rest. And if she was alive, then I wanted to let her know that I forgave her. Hired a PI to help. I guess she was moved by my story, and so she also ran info for the man my mother apparently married to on the house. And with one clue from his report, I was able to track them down. I wouldn't have found my mom, alive, and was just starting out on recovery after being homeless and addicted for many, many years, if it wasn't for the PI who kindly ran an extra report for free. Mom has remained sober now for about 7 years and is probably the healthiest she's ever been, physically and emotionally. Story 7. I was a private investigator for a little bit. Most work PIs do is searching financial/court records and serving documents. But one time, I was paid by wealthy parents to stake out their college senior who had stopped returning their calls. They were worried about her. These parents paid $40K for round-the-clock monitoring just to find out their daughter dropped out of school and was a full-time ski bum. By the way, stakeouts are mostly just sitting in your car, reading all day. Not gonna lie, the idea of being on a stakeout and just eating Philly cheesesteak and whittling wooden steak or anything else you can do with steaks, I don't know, the idea of just sitting in your car and eating food and waiting for people, I guess, has always been appealing. Is that gross? I just want to eat food and watch people. No, I mean, the idea of just basically doing nothing and getting paid for it. That's not how I meant it. Story 8. Not me, but my grandfather did. He was separated from his brother when the Japanese occupied China. My grandfather safely made it to Hong Kong and eventually to Canada. His brother made it to Singapore or Malaysia according to family friends back then. So my grandfather spent a good 5 years or so working with a PI to find his brother so they could be reunited. Sadly, with just a picture and the fact many people died in the war, it wasn't much to go on. My grandfather is still alive and always thinks of his brother. It's his wish to see him one more time. Edit. Provided response and thread below and copied here. Wow, thank you everyone for the kind wishes and suggestions. To let you know, my grandfather worked with this PI many years ago, say between 99 to 2004-ish, and maybe a few touch points here and there in the years after. My grandfather was disheartened because he made many trips to Asia over the years thinking, this is it, but it just cost more money and got his hopes up. No clue if the brother married, if he even made it to Singapore or Malaysia, or it can be even outside of Asia altogether. Not even sure if he's alive. He would be in his late 80s now, estimated. He has not spoken about it directly with me, just with my mom, his daughter. If I'm being honest, we haven't exactly encouraged him to continue the search either. All my aunts and uncles tell him to move on and enjoy his life in peace rather than in constant yearning. I don't have the status in the family to overstep my mom and her siblings and start bringing up the past and asking him to consider a DNA kit. If I do, I'd have to do it in secret and consider the emotional investment my grandfather may make. He's not living unhappily by any means. He has a great life and quite accomplished with raising 6 kids to have families and homes of their own. We each take care of him. He has tons of friends, likes to cook. We use WeChat to talk to anyone and everyone. Travel, pre-COVID, and read. He does want to see his brother, but as time goes by, the memory and drive becomes more faint, and eventually, the day-to-day life just makes it easier for him to accept the circumstances. Oh man, I was hoping this was gonna have a happy ending. They get separated years and years ago back in China. China, a lot of people. They get separated all the way back then, and he's just been searching for his brother, like the bond of family. Reddit, people of the internet. The internet is like king of finding people. So, whatever information you have to go on, do your thing. That's sad. Story 9. In his 20s, my significant other hired a PI to find out what had become of the childhood bully who had made his life heck and who had vowed to kill him. Actually, he did try bringing a loaded gun to school, but some other kid ratted him out and the bully got expelled. But still lived in the neighborhood for a few more years and beat up my significant other every chance he got. The PI found the bully living in a town more than an hour outside the big city, in a dead-end job. He'd been arrested for assault and public drunkenness a couple of times. That info helped my significant other get past his fear that the guy would find him someday and make good on his threat. I'm glad that the info brought him some peace, but I'm just curious how finding out he lives about an hour away and he's upset and has been arrested multiple times, is drunk and upset with his life and his dead-end job is, comforting. If anything, that's a guy who, is a bit reckless and might do some dangerous things. I would, don't reconnect on Facebook at all if he's still upset. But yeah, that doesn't bring me peace at all. Story 10. Had a babysitter we thought was stealing from us. Luckily, our neighbor was a PEI couple and they ran a background check for $10. Babysitter had a string of DUIs, and a few days before a large fine was due, my camera disappeared. He also stole money from my kids' piggy banks. He sort of disappeared, but was also really into Instagram, so I surreptitiously followed him. He started babysitting again for a single mom, easy target, and posted a lot of fun pics with this family. I tracked down the mom and sent her a long email detailing out his whole scam. She said we were right, and it was clear he'd been stealing from her business. He has since gone underground, but I still Google him regularly to see what he's up to. He's been able to avoid arrest for a while now. Story 11. I used to work for an insurance defense firm years ago. Best PI story I have is where we hired one to tail a guy who was suing our client for an injury that wasn't entirely our client's fault. The guy was refusing to settle and was insisting on going to trial even though we offered a fair sum that would have paid his medical bills. The PI we hired got some good pics that showed the plaintiff was nowhere near as injured as he claimed. But the crown jewel of the photos was one where the guy was walking on a pier with a woman who wasn't his wife, had his hand on her butt and everything. Later, in the deposition, the attorney slid the picture to the plaintiff and said something like, "Mr. Smith," obviously not his real name, "who is the woman in the picture? We would like to schedule a deposition with her as well." The guy went ghost white and told his attorney he wanted to settle. At least he was smart enough to realize that if his wife found out the other woman was going to be deposed, he was going to have to get a family law attorney as well, because the divorce papers would soon follow. Edit. To clarify some points in the comments, no, this is not technically blackmail. Our firm had the PI follow him to see if he was faking his injuries, which is standard operating procedure, not to see if he was cheating on his wife. We had no idea he was doing that. The fact the woman in the picture was his mistress was irrelevant. The attorney would have asked for the person's contact info even if she were just a friend, coworker, cousin, or whatever. The attorney wanted to depose her to ascertain the extent of the guy's injuries. At no point did the attorney say, "Just drop the suit or we'll out your affair to your wife." Story 12. My mom's best friend. She divorced her husband and was awarded full custody of their daughter. His family was a crap show. He kidnapped his daughter, and he and his parents just disappeared. This was easier in 1977 than it is now. She tried hiring a PI but couldn't afford one, so she started learning how to trace people on her own. In the days before the internet, she spent years doing this whenever she wasn't waitressing. She did find her daughter in 1981, but by this time her daughter was poisoned against her. Mom's friend went on to get her PI license and was a PI specializing in women's issues for the next 2 decades. I don't know what happened to her after that. If she's alive, she would be in her 80s, I think. Edit. Thank you for the upvotes, everyone. There's a couple of common questions that people are asking about this. Did mom and daughter reconcile? I asked my mother about that. She lost contact with her friend when mom left Texas over 20 years ago. The last she knew, no, they never reconciled. They communicated, but that's it. What about the police? As I explained in another comment, it was different in the 70s. Unlike now, it was easy to assume a new identity and easy to get lost. It was hard to find people who didn't want to be found. The most popular method of assuming a new identity became a plot point in the 1986 movie Highlander. Police usually consider kidnapping by a spouse to be a civil matter to be handled by the courts. It was low priority for the police. Amber Alerts also weren't a thing until 1996. Before that were just milk cartons with pictures of kids on them. Edit. Amber Alerts started in 1996. Before that, there were several other ways to highlight missing kids. Adam Walsh was famous. Kids appeared on television, often after the show America's Most Wanted. Story 13. One of my jobs is to search for long-lost relatives, usually several generations ago. Typically, the case is about old plots of land where I should track down owners or their heirs to update the land registry because a state wants to build there something. Let me tell you, the amount of information you can find on Google and in public records is astounding if you know where to look. Story 14. Not a PI, and haven't hired one, but I used to work in the office of a PI firm that specializes in insurance fraud. I would edit and sometimes write surveillance and background investigation reports that we passed along to our clients, mostly lawyers and insurance companies. One thing that never failed to surprise me, an astounding number of people who claim to suffer devastating disabilities regularly post pictures and videos of themselves running marathons and building decks in their yards. I'm comfortable saying that in at least half of the cases I handled over 2 years, our clients flagged their claimants as fraudulent because of social media. Disgruntled exes are another significant source of tips. To give an example of one of the most remarkable instances in which social media saved a case, it's summer, and on the day of surveillance, our investigator sees the claimant and his family loading their car with beach stuff. The claimant drives for a couple of hours before the investigator eventually loses sight of the vehicle. Side note, tailing someone in a vehicle without 1. Arousing suspicion, or 2. Losing the vehicle is hard. The investigator, being way too far from his own home to drive home, checks into a motel. The next morning he checks his phone and finds that the claimant checked in at a water park on Facebook. Investigator makes a pit stop to buy some swim trunks and a beach towel. Drives to the water park and gets hours of covert footage of the claimant swimming in a wave pool, going down water slides, picking up and putting down his kids, and generally doing a whole lot of things you probably shouldn't be able to do with a serious spine injury. Too long didn't read, if you're gonna commit insurance fraud, stay the heck off social media. Wow, what a find. And you know, that's awesome, and it's baller, and that's cool, but I'm just curious, what is the line? Genuinely, I'm asking because I don't know. Between stalking and private investigating. Because you're not an officer of the law, but it sounds like you have a license, but people are also just hiring you to follow someone of their choosing, and I don't know how it all works. Like, can you just be like, hey, just go follow this person and just tell me what they're doing? Like, where's the it feels like legal stalking, but I don't know. But I mean, that's crazy how they found this guy. Story 15. On the other end of the PI spectrum, I was in a bad car accident 13 years ago. I was rear-ended at a red light by a lady going 45. Most of my injuries were soft tissue damage minus the TMJ. Fast forward 8 years, finally had my court day to see if I'd get $90K in damages. They show camera footage from 4 years prior covering 3 whopping days of me pushing a grocery cart, carrying groceries, and talking on the phone. Apparently, that's enough to determine that you're fine. Present day. Every morning my hands go numb. It takes 3 days to clean one room. I can't braid my hair. Various other numerous tasks that take me way longer than any normal 41-year-old. Sometimes you have to do things because you still want to feel normal, not like you're a 90-year-old woman. Story 16. My good friend was raised by her mom growing up, who would always tell her that her father had walked out on them when she was just a baby, and that he had never wanted anything to do with her. My friend took it really hard and struggled through her entire childhood believing in that. But then, a couple of years ago, she hired a PI to see if they could find him again. Well, they did, and it turned out what her mother told her was a lie. Her dad is seriously one of the sweetest and soft-hearted guys I've ever met. He left because my friend's mom forced him out when he uncovered her infidelity. I guess he wasn't actually her dad because her mom cheated on him while they were together. but he loved her like she was his own and has only avoided contacting her because her mom convinced him he legally has no rights to her child. And even worse, she threatened to accuse him of SAing my friend when she was a baby if he reached out anyway. Thankfully, my friend is an adult now and has moved out from her mom's house, and she can have the relationship with her dad that she always wanted. It just sucks that she had to go through the effort of hiring a PI to achieve that. Edit. I talked to my friend to get a few more details, and apparently the left when she was a baby thing was a bit of an exaggeration. He left when she was about 22 months old. He only found out she wasn't his child a month prior to that. To be quite honest, I never questioned that it might be weird for them to be so connected to each other emotionally, because in his eyes, she is his daughter, and in her eyes, he is the dad she briefly had and then was denied access to her entire life. They have a great relationship now, and she's gone NC with her mom. Edit 2. Finding him had to do with tracking down the man whose name is on her birth certificate. That man is her dad, aka not her bio dad. Well, you gained a father and you lost a mom. I think the only thing to do now is to hire another PI to find the biological father and have two dads. But maybe, they might not get along at that point. Story 17. Not mine specifically, but my mother hired one to spy on the school. See, my little brother is dyslexic and has severe social anxiety, and so was struggling a lot in the public school setting. He had an IEP, which the teachers and principals were insisting was being followed. But every day, my brother would come home in tears shaking because he felt abandoned and stupid. So my mom hired the investigator, and sure enough, the teachers were basically just ignoring my brother. They'd sit him in the back of the room and demand he do his work, and then wouldn't help him through it. Then they'd yell at him because he didn't do it. Again, he couldn't write because of dyslexia. With all the evidence, my mom was able to arrange a meeting with the school board and threatened to sue. They agreed to pay his tuition for a private school that was supposed to help. It didn't, and mom ended up just pulling him out and homeschooling him. He's been doing a lot better. So wait, how old was the kid? I'm thinking like elementary school. How did the private investigator figure all that out? That they sat him in the back of the room and they would yell and they'd do this and not help him with his work. Like, I'm picturing the like the benchwarmers. I'm 12. Like, they're just going in there and pretending to be kids. How do you get information like that? I'm so fascinated by this. Sorry, let's continue. Story 18. Not me, but my dad. My mom's a hoe. I could have told him myself, but I didn't want to hurt his feelings and he wanted hard evidence anyway. ETA. If I remember right, it was 5 different guys at one time. One might have been the meth dealer, but he might have come later. It's been a while and there was a lot to keep up with. PI was like, I'm sorry, you really got your money's worth. I had his back twice by telling the guys that she was married and that we all still lived together. Pretty entertaining breakups were my immediate reward. Not having to go with her to watch her date guys behind my dad's back was my long-term reward. Turns out, dad doesn't have any biological children. Story 19. Not me, but a friend hired one because he was suspicious his stepdad was being unfaithful to his mom. So he asked me, and I put him in contact with a guy I knew. Bit of a backstory, the stepdad is 5'10" and 160 pounds. My friend is 6'2", 235 pounds, ripped. At 15, when my friend's mom and stepdad started dating, my friend gave the typical, "You heard her, you're dead" speech. Also, his bio dad walked out on him and his sister when my friend was like 4. It took a while, but my friend warmed up to the guy and he's a good guy. Took my friend and I to a 49ers game once, which was pretty cool. Anyway, the PI said he wasn't cheating. Apparently, there was a house on the market that my friend's mom wanted, and he bought it. He had been remodeling it for some time, and he kept it a secret. As a 5-year anniversary gift to her, he bought it. Anyways, they live in a 5-bed house now. Absolute baller move by the stepdad. Story 20. My dad was cheating on my mom with 2 different old men. Both of them don't know about the other one. He says he isn't gay or anything, he's just doing it for the money. He told us that he's in their wills and everything and that they're just friends. I don't believe it. How do you end up in a friend's will? There's definitely something else going on, but he won't admit it. My mom calls him El Buitre as a code word for him. It means the vulture in Spanish. Edit. When I said, how do you end up in a friend's will, I meant someone you just met. I don't mean best friends or anything. They just met and my dad already moved in and is in his will. I understand putting close friends in wills if you don't have kids or little to no family. Yeah, there's a lot going on here. Sounds like maybe you should be hiring a PI to figure some of this out. Also, that whole El Buitre, whatever it was, okay? I biffed it, right? Story 21. My boyfriend's family hired a PI to do some covert genealogy because they're white, but all have thick, wiry hair that only black hairdressers can handle, and because there are things older folks in these parts just don't talk about. Turns out there's a fair amount of Lumbee Indian, a community founded by disenfranchised Native Americans and escaped slaves back in the day, in my boyfriend's family, which explains the hair. Story 22. I was the recipient of a PI. I came home from work one day and my boyfriend asked to have my engagement ring, as he wanted to take it to be professionally cleaned. The second he handed it over, he accused me of cheating on him. The conversation went back and forth for ages. I was beside myself. I couldn't believe what he was saying and he would not believe I was innocent. He then told me he'd had me followed for 6 weeks by a PI who had seen me get into a red Mini. It was a girl I knew giving me a lift to work, but he would not believe me. I knew then it was over and packed my things and left. I told him to get in touch with the PI and have another look at this so-called evidence that I was cheating. An hour later, he turns up at where I was staying, begging to have me back. He'd realized his mistake. There was no way I was going to get back with someone who would behave that way, so we parted ways. Story 23. Back in the 90s, my dad had a friend who owned a Renault Clio Williams, and one day someone stole his car. The car was located in Athens. So after reporting the event to the police, he really wanted to get his car back because it was expensive, and he hired a private investigator to find his car. After like a week, he received a call from the investigator telling him that his car was located at a junkyard outside Thessaloniki. So he went to Thessaloniki and found his car. So then he rushed inside a police station to inform them that his car is located at X location. Believe it or not, the police officer told him not to mess with the owner of the junkyard. This junkyard was known for stealing cars, etc., and hopes he will get his money back from insurance. Edit. Sorry for any mistakes, I am not a native speaker. Story 24. I used to work for an insurance company that handled injury claims. More often than not, the investigator would find nothing and would give us a lot of video showing that the claimant was indeed injured. We would then bury the video, of course. There are, on occasion, people who are exaggerating their injuries, but they are by far the minority. The few cases where that does happen has a way of placing unfair suspicion on the legitimately injured people. My favorite example was a time when the insurer sent me hours of video where they had followed this young, healthy-looking, and quite physically fit fella around, leaving his house, going and working outside on a home renovation, doing lots of heavy lifting, carrying things up and down ladders, etc. All this despite a reported back injury. The insurance adjuster was all gung-ho on taking the case to trial without making any offers. Lo and behold, I look at the video, check the age of the claimant in the file, and think to myself, this guy looks awfully young for someone in his 50s. 10 minutes of Facebook research later, I work out that the PI had been following the claimant's 25-year-old son for 2 weeks. The few cases where this is actual fraud make for good stories and get told and retold, but in reality, the vast majority of claimants are on the level despite insurance company Kool-Aiders wanting to believe otherwise. I spent a lot of time having to talk them down while I did that work. Story 25. A PI tried to contact me about my father a few years ago. She was extremely rude and pushy and intimidated my sweet mother by showing her pistol she wore on her waistband. She called me once, yelling at me about why I was hiding from her, calling me my father's name. Took her 5 minutes to stop talking long enough for me to explain who I was. Warned her that if she ever threatened my mother again, I was just as armed and I'd call an actual police officer to calm her butt down. She never bothered us again. Holy power trip. Are you even allowed to do that? Like, that's crazy to go in there and start flashing a weapon and be like, tell me what I want to know. I've got all the information. I'm basically a cop, but I probably didn't pass the training. I didn't make it as a cop, but here I am, privately investigating. I don't know. That's crazy. A poor, sweet old lady, you're trying to be belligerent and yelling at people. Like, goodness gracious. Calm down. Do some investigating on the sly. Quit threatening old mothers and their child. Story 26. My uncle disappeared without a trace in the 1990s. About a year after, his daughter was kidnapped and killed. We hired a PI to track him down, and the PI found next to nothing, as my uncle had developed a drug problem following my cousin's murder. The best guess the PI had is that he had died by OD or unaliving himself, and that his body hadn't been found or he was reported as a John Doe. Imagine my family's surprise 2 decades later when my uncle calls my mother, who is his only sibling. My grandfather had been on his deathbed for a month, and somehow the uncle found out. He arrived to make a show of paying his respects in an attempt to get money out of his parents. When it was clear he wasn't getting anything, he took off once again. He never gave us a real or detailed explanation of why he left, where he'd been, and what he'd been doing. He left no address or telephone number and made no attempts to remain in contact. The PI we hired must have been a crappy one. That or my uncle really knows how to disappear. Story 27. My dad got my mom pregnant when she was 15. My dad forcibly put the child up for adoption. Nobody ever talked about it, but I found out about it because my dad became an alcoholic who would black out and talk about what was bothering him. He couldn't take the losses of his oldest son, my mom who cheated on him, and the death of my little sister. My now ex-wife decided that she wanted to find my older brother, but my paternal grandfather would not cooperate. She asked my mom about it and got as many details as she could. I was against looking for him because he probably didn't know that he was adopted, and I didn't want to screw that up for him. After she got my parents' hopes up, I agreed to hire a PI. The next day, we had pictures of a guy who looks like my uncle, a website to a small company that he had founded, and links to his profile for a lot of the high-profile jobs that he's had. We found out that he's been adopted by a college professor at what I would call the Harvard of the Midwest. The guy had a good life, much better than he would have had. I gathered the PI's report, pictures of his biological family, and some medical information that might be of use. I sent him a package via certified mail. He never responded. Years later, I found out that he was divorced around that same time, so I thought that maybe his ex didn't give him the information. I joined FaceBase just to find him. He was there with pics, so I knew that it was the same guy. I sent him a PM stating who I am, why I was contacting him, and why he had been put up for adoption. I added in the request that he would at least tell me to go to heck or something so that I would have some kind of closure from my parents. His page went private and I never heard from him. My mom died a few years ago. She was glad to know that he was well and successful but never got to meet him. My dad is doing very well now, but I know that it still eats away at him. Story 28. I have a story about a private investigator doing a hilariously crap job. So years ago, my brother injured his back at work because of his employer's unsafe work practices. During the ensuing suit, my brother's lawyer was given a folder full of documents from the employer's team. Turns out they had hired a PI to investigate my brother to prove that his injury was faked. Well, unfortunately, the PI had been taking pictures of me operating an ATV mounted leaf hopper. My brother walked into the court hearing and watched the color drain from the imposing lawyer's face when he introduced himself, looking nothing like me. Imagine thinking you won the case just to find out you know nothing about this guy. Story 29. So our local radio station has this charity fund thing called Good Morning Angels, and they donate money to people in need every day. Normally $2,000 every day to different people. A few weeks ago, a woman came on and said that she had a disabled child in a wheelchair and an older child now in her 20s. Apparently, the father was essaying both the children until he went to another country for money. So the listeners didn't believe the story, and the radio station decided to hire a PI to find out the real story. The PI went to the country where the father was, and the father didn't hesitate or hold any info back. Long story short, after lie detector tests and everything, the mother was using her disabled child and the story that the father essayed the children, which he did not, to get money while the father was still sending them $3,000 every month from where he was. The father has now decided to divorce the mother, but I do not know what is going to happen with regarding the law. Story 30. Not me, but my grandfather's first wife. Buckle in. I live in New Zealand, and this happened about 15 years ago when I was a young teen. My grandfather, Jeff, his wife, and my grandmother, Mary, and their 2 children, their son Patrick, my mom Ella, moved to New Zealand from Canada in 1986. When living in Canada, they owned a large and very beautiful inn. It was often used as the place to stay or visit by famous people and dignitaries. There's even a photo of my grandparents with a baby Justin Trudeau and his father. They ran this inn for a number of years and raised their young kids whom they adopted in the early 70s. Jeff and Mary were white folk. Their children were not. It was very scandalous at the time. Jeff was born in England and fought in World War II. He moved to Canada immediately after the war and met my grandmother Mary sometime after. He was 27 years her senior. Back in Canada, the family split their time between the inn during summer and then lived in Fort Myers, Florida during the Canadian winters. This carried on for 13 or 14 years until suddenly, and seemingly one day out of the blue, he called the family into the main hall of their inn, sat everyone down and explained that they would be selling everything and moving to Nelson, New Zealand. 2 weeks later, they were on a plane and on their way over. Jeff buys a couple of furniture businesses and a movie theater and some property. 5 or 6 years after their move, their son Patrick heads to the university in Dunedin, and their daughter Ella moves out but remains in Nelson. Jeff decides he wants a divorce from Mary and they head their separate ways. Fast forward to 2003. Jeff, Mary, and Ella have been living in Christchurch separately. Jeff has been remarried twice, and Mary has been remarried once, both since divorced. Ella now has her own child, me, and life is seemingly normal. Jeff and Mary have both independently lost any businesses or money they ever had and would now be considered middle class. Jeff decides he'd like to rekindle his relationship with Mary as it would make financial sense. Mary agrees, and they start looking for a nice new home to buy. Jeff explains that he had been declared bankrupt a number of times by this point, so he decides it's best if the house is purchased by Mary. She agrees and secures a beautiful home in a beautiful neighborhood. I move into the new house, but at this stage Jeff is still tidying up his own estate and hasn't yet moved in. He comes over one day after I finish school to talk to both Mary and myself. Note, my mom Ella was out of town, hence me moving in with them for a while. Jeff explains that a week ago, a PI called him to tell him that there was a woman in England searching for him. They confirmed that he was the right man she was looking for, and the PI explained that it was only because that he managed to trace him from England to Christchurch. The woman searching for him was his long-lost daughter from his first marriage during the war. So it turns out Jeff had a fling with a woman during the war. She got pregnant, they got married. He was deployed and fought, something happened, and Jeff was assumed dead. But Jeff didn't die. He moved to Canada. Same name, no real attempt to hide his identity ever. The PI found him. The lost daughter, Jen, got in touch. They spoke. He then reached out to his first wife, Karen, and bought them plane tickets to New Zealand. Jen and Karen stayed for a week. Then Jen lived in England. Then Karen lived in Alabama. Jen returned home after a week. Karen did not. Jen pulled a pin on moving in with Mary as he had originally planned, told her that he was going to remarry his first wife, Karen. Jeff asked for Mary for her original engagement ring so that he could give it to Karen. Mary reluctantly agreed on the condition that the engagement ring would be left to me when Jeff died. He agreed and had Karen the ring, and they got married. Jeff and Karen bought an expensive house in a fancy neighborhood, and they built an even fancier second house in an even fancier neighborhood. Karen convinced him that we, the family, were trying to pull him away from her, and she tried to alienate us from him. 1 year later, Jeff got extremely old and sick, and shortly after his diagnosis, he died. Before he died, Karen wrote us all out of the will. The second day after his death, Karen sold all of his belongings without our knowledge. The 5th day after he died, Karen got on a plane and went back to Alabama, never to be heard from again. She left with the ring, which was the only thing in the will that was left to me. We only heard from the long-lost daughter, Jen, again about 5 years after Jeff's death, when she herself was dying. Karen wasn't even here for the funeral, and she left with all the money he had hidden in trust funds over the years or from the sales of their properties. Karen died in 2010. She was buried with my ring. My grandma Mary, who is still alive, has never been able to get over this. And my mom Ella unalived herself 18 months ago. This is the story of how someone hired a PI and it unraveled our family. Jeff was great. He was definitely into some shady crap, but he was the only male role model I had growing up. He loved me like I was the most precious thing in the world. He treated me better than he ever treated his own kids, and I miss him often. But there are so many holes and small details missing from this story that my heart aches for a chance to get the full story out of him. To this day, I still wonder what the motive was for Jen and Karen trying to find him. Jen and Karen barely spoke to each other after their 1-week stay here in New Zealand, when Karen decided to live in New Zealand and remarry her first husband, Jeff. What did they fight about, I wonder? Nearly everyone in this story is dead now, so I guess I'll never know. Or maybe I could hire my own PI. This is very sad and heartbreaking, but admittedly, one of the most interesting and fascinating stories I've ever read. The little buckle up preface at the beginning did not disappoint. And I feel so bad for the guy. I hope he does hire his own PI and hopefully he finds all the information and closure he desires. And, man, what the heck? Story 31. My oldest niece's dad married a woman who was controlling. She ended up convincing him to take my sister to court for full custody of my niece, which ended up stressing my sister out so much that her water broke at 29 weeks. My parents hired a PI and found out that his wife was using EBT to buy groceries instead of the money he was giving her, and that she was getting prescriptions from 12 different doctors and a bunch of other screwed up crap. He ended up contacting her parents, who he was told were dead. After he introduced himself, her dad immediately asked how much she took from him. He wasn't the first guy she had done it to. She also wasn't using her real name. He ended up divorcing her, and she's currently doing time in a prison for a handful of charges. Story 32. I was suspicious that my first husband was cheating on me, so I hired a PI, and what happened was it turned out that my husband had a secret second job that he would go to for 3 hours at a time every few days because he was going to surprise me with a new diamond necklace for my birthday. And once I found that out, I felt super bad, so I apologized to my husband, and he got really upset that I didn't trust him, and then he divorced me. As fun as the whole PI thing is, I would recommend being careful about being so distrusting of your significant other so fast. I feel like there's been a couple stories where somebody was quick to be like, hey, what's the deal? I know you're cheating on me and I'll prove it. And they're like, well, I wasn't, but now I don't want to be with you at all. Story 33. This story is too personal and I don't want to give too many details to be found out, but my dad hired a PI because an older man was stalking my younger sister, 16 at the time, and he was in his 30s. PI found them meeting at different places, and so my dad got a restraining order, not sure if that is what it's called, for the man to not approach my sister anymore. 2 years later, my sister started acting weird and distant from my family. He got another PI to track her, and she was meeting up with this man again. But now she was 18 and said she could do whatever she wanted. She moved out of the house and moved in with this man, and the rest of the story is too sad to tell. But just wanted to vent out a little through this post I found. Story 34. This is so weird. My mom and I were literally talking about this today. Not me, but my family hired a PI. So my grandpa had a younger brother. I'll call him John. That was always the black sheep of the family. Apparently, my grandpa was quite protective of John and would always defend him to family and friends, saying he was a good kid who would figure his life out eventually. One day, John asked my grandpa to loan him a couple $1,000s to buy a house, which was no small amount in the 60s, and after talking it over with my grandma, they eventually did. John skipped town shortly after that and never contacted my grandparents again. My grandpa, being the brooding Irish man he was, never really talked about John after that. In the 80s, one of my mom's cousins was curious what happened to John and hired a PI to go looking for him. They lived in a small town in northern British Columbia, Canada, and after a while the PI found John living on the streets of Vancouver. My grandmother and my great-aunt flew to Vancouver to see him because my grandpa still wanted nothing to do with it, to see if they could bring him home. My grandmother said when they met with John, he was livid, absolutely freaking livid that they had found him. He was living with a small group of people that had turned into his little sort of street family. He told them he was very happy with his life the way it was, to leave and to never try to contact him again. And that was that. My grandmother and my great-aunt got back on a plane and flew home without him. To our family's knowledge, lived out the rest of his days on the streets of Vancouver. A couple $1,000s is crazy to try and throw your whole family life away. I mean, there must have been a girl involved or something. That's a couple $1,000s to skip town and just bail and never contact anybody ever again? Which can only buy you a lunch in Vancouver anyway. Goodness gracious. Story 35. I didn't hire him, 17-year-old female, but my mom did, 50-year-old female. My father is well over $20,000 in debt from not paying child support. He was known for living in another state and acting like I didn't exist. Although my aunt, his sister whom I've never met, wants something to do with me. He was also in the military but never took any of the money reserves. Child support would have seen that and forced him to pay us. After a while, my mom grew tired of his games and hired a PI. She told him the whole story and wanted to know where he lived, where he worked, and where his family is. He found it out. Instead of my deadbeat father being thousands of miles away, he lived a few blocks away and was living with his sister, the same one that wanted to meet me after 15 years, the one that wanted me to come over to her house for lunch. Now you have to understand, my father tried to total his truck in a brick wall in an attempt to kill my mother who was still carrying me. Never ever has he or any of his family even ever met me. They all left before I was born. But finding out that same sadistic man was a few blocks away made me feel unsafe for months. $500+ later, all that was left was disappointment and uneasiness. Child support never got evidence of his residence or work. PI was paid for his work, and we seized the job. Story 36. A very long 6-month story. I'm going to try my best to TLDR. Was scammed over $50,000 for a business I wanted to purchase. The scammer faked tax returns, income statements, you name it, to make it all sound legit. He used fake names to hide his identity and a burner phone. I contacted my bank and told them what happened, and they told me, tough crap, even though it was a wire transfer and I had proof of everything. I talked to a few of the police officers' friends and they said it was out of their jurisdiction and there wasn't really anything they could do. I emailed the Attorney General for my state and he said he couldn't do anything because it's more than likely over state lines. So I needed to contact the U.S. Attorney General. I called the USAG assistant and she told me I needed to talk to the FBI, but I would more than likely not get my money back. I called the FBI and they said I needed to file on ic3.gov, but I would more than likely not hear anything about this. I posted online on a business group on Facebook and found an additional 7 people that were also scammed from the same person. One of them had audio recordings of their phone calls. Total was over $300,000. I hired an attorney to help me out and back me up legally. He said I needed to hire a PI to find this person. I post online on a business group on Facebook. The PI starts doing their thing. Within 48 hours, they are able to find who he is and provide me with phone numbers, addresses, business names, you name it. I give all the information to my attorney and share it with the other 7 people. I look up the guy's name online and he went to prison 20 years ago for doing the same scam. Himself and 11 other individuals are in a mafia and scammed $6 million in 2 years. And the ringleader committed 6 counts of arson. My attorney got in contact with the scammer's attorney, and as of last week, I am receiving all my money back, and so are the other 7 individuals. I am truly disappointed at the fact that not one U.S. government agency seemed to give a crap about any of this. Story 37. I found the description of a car that my sister was kidnapped in. Years ago, my sister, 15 years old at the time, was kidnapped from our home in the Northeast U.S. She left us a note saying she was leaving for a better life, but we didn't buy it. The note made her a runaway, so an Amber Alert, announcement to everyone's cell phones of a missing minor, couldn't be activated since it wasn't technically a kidnapping. We hired a PI that my uncle knew. The PI uncovered a string of deleted emails within 24 hours after her disappearance, with a description of the car she's been picked up in from a guy we suspected could be your kidnapper. Let's call him Stan. To help paint a picture, Stan was 27 at the time of the incident. Should be the end right there, but it wasn't. Stan was at his home in Florida. The police went to his house and there he was just sitting there low-key. Turns out Stan had hired someone to come get my sister from my home and bring her to Florida for him, all under the promise to her that they'd live an amazing life together. Stan told this man that my family abused her and it wasn't safe for her there. All lies to squash any doubt this hired guy might have. The driver eventually spotted and was tailed by 2 undercover vehicles. They waited until he pulled over for gas to approach the vehicle, not knowing if he was armed or willing to put up a fight. I got my sister back, and after years of therapy, she's a functioning member of society with a totally cool significant other. I testified against Stan in federal court, and he was locked up 10 years ago and still resides in federal prison in Florida. Turns out he had coaxed my sister into trusting him for close to 2 years through an online game. That means it all started when she was 13 and he was 25. What a disgusting trash can of a human. TLDR, my sister went missing and a PI found a description of the car she was taken in, leading to her recovery. Story 38. My husband and mother-in-law hired a PI to find out who her biological parents were. She always knew she was adopted when she was 6 months old and that her biological mother was a single woman that couldn't take care of her, but that's all they ever told her. The PI found her mother and found out that she was the product of an affair. Her biological father was a wealthy businessman in a small town she grew up in, and her mother was his secretary. He was married and it couldn't get out that his secretary was pregnant because she was unmarried and people in the town would talk. So he sent her to a home for unwed mothers to have the baby and put her up for adoption. This was in 1942 in a small town in Arkansas. An unmarried woman getting pregnant would have been big news. So she called up her biological mother and told her who she was and her mother. She was hesitant to meet her, but eventually agreed to it. Turned out she has 2 brothers and a sister and several nieces and nephews. And they kept in touch for a few months. Then they cut ties when they found out what giant pieces of crap my mother-in-law and brother-in-law are. So yeah, my husband doesn't get to know his aunts, uncles, and cousins because of his narcissistic mom and brother. Money well spent, I guess. Story 39. My grandfather once hired a PI to investigate my grandmother. While spying on her from his car, another investigator he knew came up frantically to his window and was like, "What are you doing here?" To which his response was obviously, "What are you doing here?" Turns out my grandmother was being investigated by the DEA for drug dealing. I don't think anything came of it that I know of, but we're all pretty certain it's the reason the old family barn was burned down. That woman was butt crap crazy, and this isn't even the worst and wackiest story I've been told about her. The grandmother? Hey, look, you're never too old to break bad. Story 40. My grandmother and great-grandmother had baby boys weeks apart, and my grandma loved her brother like her son. When he grew up, he got married and had a daughter, but the mom became a drug addict and left him with their infant daughter that we'll call Bree. So on St. Patrick's Day in SF, he goes to a bar and a drunk cop is partying and shoots into the air. The bullet instantly kills Grandma's brother. Grandma sues SF Police Department, wins a boatload of money that is put in Bree's name. A few weeks later, Bree is kidnapped. Grandma hired a PI to find Bree. She looked for years and years. They never found anything useful, just that all the money was gone from the account. Fast forward over 30 years, one day Grandma was taught how to use Facebook. You can bet the first thing she did, she found Bree. No one could believe it. She came to live near us for a while, but you could tell she felt like she didn't fit in. She didn't remember any of us. She ended up moving away and doesn't keep much in contact. She was nice, but too conservative to fit in with our more liberal family. Wow, that really sucks how important and how much freaking emphasis we put on political morals and values and whatnot. I mean, you just found your long-lost granddaughter over 30 years, and they're just like, we don't really bond that well. That's your family, though. My family could vote for E.T. in the next election, and I'd still want to be with him. I don't know. Politics. Story 41. I briefly worked for a PI when I was much younger, like 19. Getting the job was a funny story itself. I was walking past the office, which is in this tiny strip mall smack in the middle of a residential neighborhood. On a whim, I decided to go in and see what a real PI's office looked like. Pretty unremarkable, except for the huge biker sitting at the only desk in a polo shirt and slacks. We got to chatting, and I asked if he was hiring. He laughed and asked me what kind of work I was expecting. I told him, probably a lot of boring work sifting through papers in the library and courthouse. He laughed again. He did that a lot. We called him Santa because of that and his white beard, and he gave me the job. I worked there for 3 months, during which we did a lot of insurance work that consisted mostly of sitting in a car, reading a book, occasionally taking pictures of some guy in a neck brace or a leg cast walking to or from his car, and 2 or 3 times taking pictures of a guy playing baseball or basketball in his backyard. But Santa also had a much reduced rate for tracking down biological parents, siblings, and children. We had one case where this woman in her 30s wanted to find her bio mom. We went on our usual course, visiting courthouses, city halls, and libraries to track this woman down. We spent a whole month on it. We also worked other cases during that time, which was a bit longer than usual, as the woman didn't know her mother's name, only her adopted parents, who had passed years ago. The woman didn't have any of the adoption paperwork either and didn't know where it would be filled. This was in the 90s when not everything was digital. I finally found the adoption paperwork in a courthouse in the next county over and got a name. I was running late. Santa didn't let me work overtime, so I made to drop off the copies of the paperwork at his office and go. But the guy stopped me before I could leave. He was all excited by the mother's name. It's his wife. His wife who'd given up a baby for adoption 30-something years ago. He called his wife, who dug up her copies of the adoption paperwork from back when, and sure enough, It's a match. We called the client, who didn't answer, then went and picked up his wife and drove to the client's home. She's on the phone with her adopted sister talking about our effort. The PI and his wife immediately bear hugged the woman, who was very confused. Both were too emotional to get the words out. So I explained that the woman was her bio mom and the PI her husband. Freaking beautiful scene, man. That memory is one of the things that's kept me from turning bitter over the years. It was enough to put off my then imminent loss of faith in God for another decade or so, that this woman had hired her bio mom's husband to find her bio mom. That is insane. And yeah, freaking beautiful, man. Wow! What a win. If only all cases were that easy. Oh, you're looking for this person? I think I know where they're at. Story 42. I didn't hire one, but my parents did. I was 14 and met another teen online. My parents knew if they came down on me or forbid me to talk to him, I would rebel big time. So they hired one and sat me down to tell me it was actually a 40-year-old man who had been grooming me and was trying to lure me to his state. I'm forever thankful they did that, and honestly, up until last week, I never told a soul this. But it came out in therapy, and I started to heal from it and take my power back. Seriously, I can't say it enough, parents. Please monitor your kids' online friendships. Story 43. I've been tracked by a PI. Not sure what they found, but it couldn't have been interesting because it was never used. My ex-husband couldn't let go after I left and hired them. I'd find them on my front lawn in the morning taking pictures of my car as I loaded it up. I'd see them follow me when I left the house. One got onto the secure site I worked at and hung out at the smoker spot just casually trying to listen to me chat with a coworker. Cause hanging out in a secure spot randomly with a group of regular smokers isn't gonna look obvious. He even tried to get into the building. I reported it, but I'm permanently paranoid people are following me. Freaking crazy ex-husband. Story 44. I didn't hire one, but my back crap crazy abusive ex did. A few months after we started dating, I felt like I was being watched and saw the same car following me. He said I was crazy, but then a year later he was all, you know how you thought you were being followed when we first dated? You were. I hired a PI. He seriously thought it was so funny. I was shocked and upset because I wasn't doing anything untrustworthy. I asked if he found out anything, and he replied, "Oh yeah, they said you went shoe shopping when you told me you were grocery shopping. You were totally lying." I spent the next 2 years trying to leave the emotionally and physically abusive relationship. He threatened to burn my family's house down or kill me if I did. Finally managed to plan and execute a safe escape, but he stalked and harassed me afterwards and I had to get a restraining order. I had the same being watched feeling and the cops had to warn him, but he claimed hiring a PI wasn't a breach of an RO and had a right to know what I was doing. He also told me he hired a PI to check up on a teacher who once laughed at him and couldn't wait until she died to pee on her grave. That is super messed up. Before she got to the point that she was like trying to leave and I didn't see that she had left immediately, I was like, well, I'm no relationship expert, but that's quite the red flag. But I mean, she tried to leave and she's got a restraining order and the guy's still stalking her. Peeps, be crazy. Hey, if you're out there, stay safe. Huh? Story 45. My mom and I got into a big fight one day. She was verbally, emotionally, and physically abusive and manipulative. On this particular day, she told me to get the F out of her home. I was so overwhelmed but didn't even hesitate. I left my house in my old AF car while it was storming super hard. She then came outside in the rain with just a long shirt on and slammed her hands on the hood of my car, begging me not to leave. She's bipolar and has manic depressive disorder. Anyway, I backed out of the driveway and went to my crappy boyfriend at the time's house. She didn't know where he lived, but figured I was with him. She called my phone literally hundreds of times begging me to come home and threatening to unalive himself by OD of her prescriptions. This was all just an attempt to manipulate me and she didn't even attempt anything. I stayed the night at my ex's house and went to school the next day. My mom called a PI to find me. Apparently this guy sucked at his job. Somehow he didn't manage to think of attempting to call my school because my mom didn't think I would be at school. He also didn't see me walking to and from school to where my ex lived. It was literally across the street from my school. I don't know, never saw anyone or know much more than that. I went back home after 2 days since the woman my ex lived with told me to leave since she had 3 kids, 2 friends of the kids, 5 dogs, and probably 10 cats living there. She was a hoarder and the house was infested with roaches absolutely everywhere, including inside the fridge and everywhere food was kept. It was so disgusting. So leaving was both good and bad, I guess. Anyway, don't try to get the cheapest PI available. I said private eye to watching you, but only if you you don't chins out. Story 46. Not a PI, but my girlfriend's mother wanted to find an old British boyfriend she got when she was young. This was before Facebook and all that, and he was an old guy and didn't have any online presence at all. But I was able to track him down through one of his daughters. When we tried to contact him, he was elusive and suspicious. He didn't believe me at first. When they finally met, he explained that he received a lot of harassment for his beliefs. Turns out he was a Holocaust denier and wrote a book about that. The conclusion of my girlfriend's mother was that sometimes it's better to leave things in the past. What? I didn't know there were deniers of that. That's not something you really have a conspiracy theory over? Story 47. I had to hire one to help gather evidence to defend myself against an assault charge. The story goes like this. X attacks me in front of a witness that I don't know, steals my phone, then calls the cops on me. I get arrested and she wipes my phone and steals some incriminating evidence from my place while I'm in jail. I get out and hire the PI to try and track down the witness. The Friday before a Tuesday trial, I finally find the guy and have the PI go to talk to him to avoid the witness tampering. Guy refuses to get involved, so I think I'm screwed because my ex is this tiny little girl who plays the victim all too well. I call up my lawyer to accept the plea deal. Turns out the prosecutor had barely spoken to the ex until that day. Due to fortunate timing, the prosecutor met with my ex before my lawyer could get a hold of them. The prosecutor realizes my ex is completely deranged and also admits to having attacked me multiple times that night, destroying any case. I get the call, all charges dropped, most relief I've ever felt in my life. So the weird thing was, the PI didn't really help directly, but working with him to find the witness kept me from accepting the crap plea deal for just long enough for things to work themselves out. Story 48. My grandma's older brother was kidnapped whenever he was under 10 years old. I can't remember exactly how old. From the state fair. It was believed his uncle was the one that took him because his dad passed away early on and his brother wasn't happy that my great-grandma got custody and another man was raising his nephew. One day we were sitting out on the back porch looking through old photo albums when we came across a picture of him and my grandma and told us about what happened. About a year and a half to 2 years later, her health went downhill. It was 60 plus years since he was kidnapped and my grandma was a couple months from passing, so my mom and aunt hired a PI who managed to find him. He had been living in Brazil ever since he was taken and had an entire family down there. They got to reconnect over FaceTime and she got to meet an entire side of her family she didn't even know existed. They talked on the phone and FaceTimed numerous times a week all the way up until she passed. At least she was able to kind of have that last little bit of closure. That sucks. Story 49. Guy who runs the warehouse at work claimed he was injured on the job. We staked out his house and saw him a couple hours later carrying a giant bag of dog food. Turns out it was actually his sister, who looks a lot like him. Anyway, he spotted us and we had to make a quick getaway and we had to bang up a few trash cans in an invasive maneuver. In the end, we deduced he had been using a lift improperly to skip using the stairs and had actually been injured by busting through a railing they had to climb over onto the lift. Story 50. I didn't hire a PI, but my uncle did because my cousin ran away from home. My uncles are wealthy, and as the only child of my third uncle, she was and would have always been provided for in every way. But the only thing my cousin wanted in life was to fall in love and be a mother, and my wealthy relatives couldn't give her that. She didn't want to have an arranged marriage. Soon after finishing her secondary education, she ran away with a boyfriend she'd been keeping secret, got married and had a baby. She was his third or fourth wife. The PI checks in on her once a year and reports to my family on how she's doing. The boyfriend wasn't a good husband. My uncles tried to pull her and the baby out of the situation, but it only pushed her further away from us. Last I heard, she took her son and finally ran away from her husband and went back to her mother's house. It broke my third uncle's heart that she won't come back. My cousin was his shining light, and I know he misses her very much because sometimes he accidentally calls me by her name. He's extra sweet to the girls in my generation since losing his daughter. He only gets to see her in photos the PI sends. She came home only once after she left, to announce her marriage and to say goodbye. Story 51. I used to work for a law firm that defended trucking companies and their insurers. They had an investigator on staff. I was drinking buddies with him. Mostly his job entailed taking pictures or video of a guy re-roofing his house while claiming to be so disabled he cannot work. Stuff like that. Another was a guy with a severe limp, using a cane in court, yet walking away from the courthouse fine with the cane tucked under his arm. That kind of stuff. You gotta be some kind of idiot to walk into the courthouse and pretend to have a limp and then walk right back out and be like, well, as soon as I leave the courtroom, the act's over, I win. Story 52. Ooh, one I can answer. My mom was given up at birth and hired a PI to find her biological mom around 4 years ago. She didn't have enough saved to find both her parents, so she chose her mom. But in the process of finding her mom, the PI also found her dad. It turns out her dad lived in a house she would run by every day for cross country in high school, and she never knew about it, which is absolutely crazy to me. It turns out she has 3 older half-brothers, and I have 2 first cousins I never knew about. My first time meeting them was at one of their weddings a little over a year ago. I wish it was all sunshine and roses with this story, but it takes a weird turn. My mom kind of up and decided to move back to her hometown to be closer to her biological family and get a fresh start. My mom and dad weren't on the best of terms anymore, and I think that she decided it was a sign. I haven't seen her in a little over a year, and it threw a big wrench in my relationship with my newly found cousins for a while. It was no fault of theirs, but it felt like she abandoned our side of the family for this new one, so it was hard. Oh man, that story did take a dip. There was a lot of exclamation points at the beginning. Lots of, hey, this is great! And no, it turns out it was not so great. I'm sorry. Story 53. Had one do a complete background check on my sister's then boyfriend. He'd been a drug-addicted liar when she first dated him 20 years before, and I didn't believe him when he said he'd cleaned up his act. Claimed to be a successful businessman who returned home to look after his ailing mother, as well as clean and sober for the past 2 decades. I asked my sister if she wanted me to do this, and she said yes. She was sure he had changed and she wanted to allay my suspicions. Nope. Several DWIs and DUIs, and he'd only gotten out of jail for the last one a few months prior. Multiple stints in jail for credit card fraud, no consistent employment for years, just low-skill jobs he only kept for a few months at a time. I showed this all to my sister. She married him anyway. She then acted all surprised when he refused to get a job, drank all day, and started beating her. Less than 2 years later, I helped pay for her divorce. So the background check turned out to be a waste of money, not because it failed to reveal the truth, but because the truth wasn't what my sister wanted to hear. Oh, that's absolutely the worst. And true in other parts of life too, where, you can have all the facts you want, but if you're not willing to accept them, then they don't really make a diff. But what a freaking fantastic brother though, huh? Jeez, really taking care of the family. Good on you, bud.